Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here. We're very fortunate today that we have Dr. Deborah Waldrick here going to talk about this topic with us. My name is Katie Earle, and I'm the coordinator of the University Express program, and I work for the Erie County Department of Senior Services. And we do have some new folks here today, so just a couple quick housekeeping things. As you just heard, we are recording this session, and I'll try to post it online at a later date. You may think you're the only person in here with us, but I promise you there are other people. It's just that we're in anonymous participation mode, so only Dr. Waldrop and I are able to see the complete list of everyone who's here. And if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please put those in the Q&A panel, and then we'll get to those when we have a chance. If you join from a computer or a laptop, that Q&A panel probably popped up on the right side of your screen. You may just have to expand it, then you'll see the text box and send your questions right to me. If you're not seeing that up, if you look at the lower right hand of your corner, you should see a square with a question mark in it. And then if you're on a tablet or smartphone, just poke or touch your screen. Your control panel will come up, and then you'll see a circle that has 3 dots, and then you'll find your Q&A panel. So we hope you find it. We hope you participate with us. And we'll get started. So I'd like to thank the sponsors of our program, which is my Department of Senior Services, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans, because they help make the program possible. And as always, at Senior Services, we're here for you. If you have questions about programs, services, or benefits, anything at all for yourself or a loved one, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We're at 858-8526. And now I'll introduce our speaker to you. Dr. Deborah Waldrick earned her Master of Social Work degree from Syracuse University in 1979 and spent the following 20 years practicing social work in a variety of healthcare settings. Deborah worked in acute care hospitals, rehab units, nursing homes, and for hospice. She earned her PhD in Family Relations and Gerontology from Oklahoma State University in 1999 and joined the faculty of the University of Buffalo School of Social Work that same year. Presently, Dr. Waldrick teaches courses in aging and loss and grief, and she's coordinating a micro-credential titled Social Work Practice and Serious Illness Care. She is conducting community-based research about end-of-life care and decision-making in collaboration with Erie County Medical Center's dialysis unit. She is a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America, a Hartford faculty scholar, and serves as the co-chair of the National Quality Forum's Standing Committee on Geriatrics and Palliative Care. Dr. Waldrick, welcome. Thank you again for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, and it's certainly a shared experience that we've all been through. We've all heard the phrase, we're all in this together, many, many times over these last 8 to 9 months. And I just want to reiterate that the experience of loss, grief, and COVID are truly shared experiences. So I'll talk a little bit about that in how I plan on presenting that to you. But we start with the idea that COVID-19 is both an epidemiological and a psychological crisis. So coexisting crises. Nobody is immune. There are no bystanders. It's about all of us. It's truly, we're all in this truly together. So my philosophy of crisis and of pandemic is whether the glass is half full or half empty. And I tend to be a person who believes that the glass is half full, and so looking for the opportunities in this time period is something that I hope you'll take away from this presentation, because I do believe there are opportunities here for us in terms of growth and shared experiences. So my goals for the next 40 minutes are to, first of all, consider and name the losses that we're all experiencing. Secondly, then I'll talk about the types of grief, because there's an amalgam of kinds of different grief that we're all experiencing now. And then lastly, I'll end and leave you with some ideas about coping, about making meaning in this time, and about growth in this time of multiple cumulative and communal losses. There's my image always of growth in times of adversity. So let's first begin by naming the losses that are tangible, real, and very interconnected. As of this morning, we've had 12,513 cases of COVID in Erie County and 643 deaths. In New York, there have been 491,000 and 32,998 deaths. In the US, over 8.3 million cases, over 221,000 deaths. and worldwide 40.8 million cases and 1.13 million deaths. There's no mistaking the loss that accompanies those deaths and the ripple that comes from that. But in addition, there's been job loss, there's been businesses closing, budget cuts that are looming, that we're experiencing, visiting people in nursing homes by putting your hand on the window, kids losing out in school. And just as the bottom corner image illustrates, just the sadness from all of this cumulative loss. So to be sure, there have been multiple losses that we've all experienced. And so I like to thread in through my presentations some of the profound words that I think give meaning to these experiences. And this is a source I use often, Harvey and Weber on loss. And their words are that great loss and its attendant grief may be the greatest teacher of how to be empathic and available to humans. It beckons us with compelling force and obsession. It sits us on a perch overlooking an ocean of feelings of despair, regrets, dashed hopes and plans, lost and never possessed innocence, and tears of pain, fear, and loneliness. It haunts, releases, it appears again and again. It's relentless. That's the feeling of loss, I'm sure you know. And then I always also thread images. And so for me, this is just a visual of what the experience of loss is for human beings. So let's name them, because if we can name the losses we're experiencing, we can manage it. We can feel a sense of control over the loss that seems so big. So first of all, there are primary losses. So people have been ill, people have died, and there have been major life changes for so many of all of us. There also are accompanying secondary losses that we need to put names to. And the consequences may seem covert at first, but they emerge as very significant. And so the primary loss of COVID has left people with secondary losses of chronic cardiovascular disease and other, fatigue and brain fog kinds of issues. The lockdown is a primary loss, but the secondary losses have been loss of freedom, loss of, in-person relationships with people, social support, and opportunities for recreation. Social distancing is a primary loss that generates the secondary losses of minimizing emotional and physical intimacy with people, and friendships have had to take new forms. And job loss is a primary loss that's been followed again by secondary losses of financial insecurity, loss of independence, loss of healthcare, and loss of future dreams and plans for people. And so people have experienced multiple losses. There can be several primary losses, and that increases the risk for bereavement. Several simultaneous losses are what multiple losses are. There can be losses of relationships, freedom, employment, and then I think often about our first responders and the experience they've had with multiple losses day after day in their work lives. The losses that are specifically related to COVID-19 are the loss of normalcy, the fear of economic toll and financial anxiety that's like a drumbeat in the background, loss of connection, job loss of safety, worry about others, worry about loved ones, social distancing and feeling so completely isolated, working or educating from home when you don't want to be doing that, very much changed routines, canceled plans and events, big events like weddings and funerals and parties and all those ways that we come together as a social context. Clashes with family members over protective behaviors. So either too much, not enough, worry about bills and rent and utilities, sadness about the world, fear of the future, and missing the old economy. So other losses that are not related to COVID-19 have also happened in this time. But how we've been dealing with those deaths from other reasons or other losses has been totally influenced by our experience of COVID-19. There's a collective sorrow, a communal loss that we experience, and we're not used to this kind of collective grief in the air. We're grieving on both micro or individual personal levels, as well as on organizational and community levels, and on a national level. After a death, we ordinarily turn to others for support and friends and family to cry, to share memories. And the pandemic has wreaked havoc with the opportunity for us to have those rituals. There have often been feelings of guilt because a family member died alone because we couldn't visit, There's a lack of closure, no opportunity to have said goodbye. There's a loss of tradition and feelings of isolation. Technology can be used to lessen some of this isolation, and here's one place where I think the glass is half full. WebEx, Zoom, LifeWeb 360, Gathering Us, and Tribute are some opportunities that people have come up with for us to share in a virtual way. Grief naturally follows these losses, and grief is about turning inward, recalibrating, and thinking, this is not the way the world is anymore, and I need to adapt. It's okay to feel grief over what we're losing. When we do that, it allows grief to do its job so we can move forward. So, yes, the discomfort that you and I are, and all of us are feeling is truly grief. And I'm going to talk about 3 specific types of loss that are very intermingled. Ambiguous loss, which is a living loss. Anticipatory loss, which is where we're uncertain what our future looks like, what the future holds. We know something bad is happening, but you can't see it, and you're imagining the worst. And then the combination of the multiple losses I spoke about, primary plus secondary losses simultaneously. But Katie and I talked about the need to stop because I do kind of get on a roll. So I'm going to stop and just ask Katie if there are any questions, thoughts, or comments that anyone wants to share at this point before I move into the specific losses.
I'm not seeing anything yet. I think everyone's just absorbing, so please continue.
Okay, and there are a couple of other places along the way that I'll also stop for questions and thoughts. So we'll begin with disenfranchised loss and grief. And this was first characterized by Arne Hochschild and Kenneth Doka, and Doka has written about this for decades now. And disenfranchised loss is a loss that's not recognized or validated or supported by the social world around us. It breaks the feeling rules that we in our society have, where a person's feelings are not supported and the loss is judged as not worthy. It's a loss that's considered not legitimate or a less than loss. And one of the examples that came to my mind as I was preparing this was back in May when seniors in high school were not going to have the opportunity to both have their senior proms and their graduation. And people thought, often I heard commentary about that being, well, why is that such a big deal? Well, it's a very big deal for someone who's 18 and graduating from high school. So that I think was one example of some of the disenfranchised losses. We somehow prioritize the losses that we think are more important in this. A griever, someone who is grieving a loss, is not thought to feel a loss. This is another way we disenfranchise losses. And specifically, we disenfranchise children, older adults with dementia. We don't think they can feel loss, and they so much do. And the same with people who have intellectual or developmental disabilities. We don't think they understand, and there is definitely the sense of loss. Disenfranchised loss can come when death has been stigmatized, or it's from some form of embarrassment, that shrouds that death. And it can be disenfranchised, grief can be disenfranchised when someone is too expressive or seemingly not expressive enough. We have very clear expectations of what the grief response should look like. But the bottom line is disenfranchised loss is that which is not considered worthy of support by others. Some of the elements of disenfranchised loss are that it's discordant with our rules, that it's unsanctioned, that it's absent of mourning rituals, which is where I think that so many of the losses of COVID are disenfranchised, because we don't have a way to really ritualize some of our needing to process this. Grief is not expressed at the proper time. We have lots of rules about grief and loss in our society. There could be economic or legal problems that come from it. And there can be emotional problems where the nature of the loss leads to very exaggerated emotions. But I want to leave you with this thought about disenfranchised loss. Grief that is unseen, hidden away, or misunderstood does not receive the support that it needs. Pay close attention to people who are experiencing disenfranchised loss. Anticipatory loss is another form of loss and grief that we're experiencing now. And anticipatory loss is the mourning, the coping, and the interaction and planning when we're only anticipating and impending, or we're aware of a loss that's coming our way, or we're fearing it. It's the recognition of associated losses in the past, the present, and the future. My best example of this is when someone is living with a very serious type of cancer, a terminal cancer, for instance. We're mourning the past of the way life was. We're mourning the present for what we're going through, and we're anticipating that we're going to be mourning the loss of the person in the future. It's more of a silent type of grief than after a loss. It's a grief we keep to ourselves, but it's there, always in the background. It's the sense you probably had of the beginning of the end, knowing something is coming. And it is the simultaneous lived experience of holding on to, letting go, and drawing closer. And I know that sounds a little schizophrenic. It's a little bit hard to wrap your head around it, but I think you know what I mean when I say that it's like the beginning of the end and you're just anticipating that something is coming. I think we've lived in a fury of anticipatory loss in this pandemic, not being sure who will get sick. If I get sick, will I recover? What will happen next? It's that constancy of worry. And finally, ambiguous loss is another form of loss that's really been pervasive in this time. It's the inability to confirm an end. There's no relief in sight. We don't know when this will really be over. It is a form of frozen grief where it's difficult to process the grief because its definition is so uncertain. It's all around us, but it's not defined. My visual here of the bubbles is, for me, the best example of this. They're not really clearly, you can't really clearly focus on any one, but you know they're there. It's two forms of ambiguous grief have been described in the past. One is where the person is physically present, but psychologically absent. And that would be someone who perhaps has Alzheimer's disease or a traumatic brain injury. They're physically with us, but they may not be mentally able to focus as clearly. Or they're physically absent, someone who may be in prison or has been kidnapped, for example, for extreme examples, but they're psychologically present and they're at our dinner table, whether or not they're physically there. We think of them all the time and they're with us. It's unclear how we are to adapt to an ambiguous form of loss. It's confusing, it's baffling, and it can be very immobilizing. Rituals, again, are unavailable. There's very little social support for ambiguous losses. It feels irrational because nothing is clear. And grief is unending. And for me, these descriptions really fit the communal losses that we've been experiencing as a society and as a world. In the pandemic, there's a loss of a way of life, perhaps a loss of trust, loss of freedom, loss of high quality education, loss of rituals, loss of our freedom to move about our social environment. And this comes from Pauline Boss, who's the academic scholar who's really articulated all about ambiguous loss, and she's been writing about the ambiguous loss of the pandemic. So I wanted to bring her words to you. And so there are multiple losses, and these losses all exist simultaneously. So there can be loss of more than one person in this pandemic, or for other reasons at the same time. There can be losses of persons and property. For instance, losses of health, losses of a loved one, but also loss of job and loss of security. There can be the loss of more than one person in addition to valuables and opportunities, which means that our hopes die almost instantly when there are multiple losses from the same event. And I think often about the families who've dealt with COVID, but also dealt with the fires in the West, with the floods and the hurricanes simultaneously, people who've lost property and needed to go to a shelter and worrying about getting COVID. There's just been, so much multiple, both primary and secondary losses that we've experienced over this time. So some of our biopsychosocial loss is not just an emotional experience. We experience loss on all levels of ourselves. So there are very specific somatic or physiological responses to loss. There's a tightness in our throat. We get short of breath. There can be a disturbed sleep pattern. Either I can't sleep through the night, or I wake up all the time having dreams. There can be a loss of energy, just a malaise that comes from this feeling of overwhelming loss. And there can be changes in appetite, either eating way too much or not able to eat at all. There's an intrapsychic responses to loss. There can be a sense of numbness, of shock, of disbelief, of denial that this is really happening, a disorientation, sadness that's pervasive and all-encompassing. There can be feelings of depression, anger, fear, anxiety, guilt, and I put sadness in there twice. I think there's a double sadness in this kind of loss. There are behavioral manifestations of loss where there's crying. There can be just abject sobs, crying for, just out of the blue, crying lots more than ordinarily. A loss of interest. There can be a restlessness, and there can be hostile outbursts that come from our response to loss. What I want to also remind you of is that our immune systems and our neurological systems and our cardiovascular systems are very stressed by loss. And so there can be secondary effects in our long-term well-being from loss as well. So managing it, working through it is something that's really important for our overall health. So some of the reactions after the loss of a loved one it's often accompanied by a sense of disbelief, again, sadness, frequent thoughts and memories of the person, difficulty concentrating or being interested in anything. It just isn't normal. I can't focus. I can't do what I was doing before. There can be a sense of confusion, of muddled thinking. I just can't think clearly about what I need to do next. There can be a sense of disconnection from others, a yearning or a longing, a physical sense of yearning and longing for that person, and doing things to try and feel close to that person who has died, trying to avoid the memories that can be so very painful. I've identified through the literature that I have found for preparing for this presentation, some very pandemic specific grief reactions. And so see if these fit for you. First of all, trouble focusing on normal tasks because this new normal isn't normal and we don't know what to make of that. People who are sleeping much more or much less than usual. Feelings of anger and irritability that come out in social demonstrations of that publicly in some ways, also within our families. There can be feelings of headache and upset stomach, it just physiologically troubles us. There's fatigue or low energy that's come. There can be re-experiencing this whole communal pandemic grief triggers for us previous losses that we've experienced. So it brings back grief reactions that we may have thought were put away or we had worked all the way through. We may find that we're eating, drinking, or shopping online to cope with anxiety in ways that we wouldn't have before. And in some ways, people have tried to avoid thinking or talking about the pandemic. But truly, this visual is a message I want you to take away, that your grief is your grief. We each experience this grief in our very own unique and distinct way. It's very individual. Mine is not the same as yours. That we are all experiencing it is what's shared, but the expression of that is unique and distinct to each of us. So I'm sure that you've heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I can never give a presentation or teach a class about loss and its resulting grief without honoring the legacy of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who back in the 60s interviewed people who were dying. She was a trailblazer in the field of loss and grief, and for her work, we now have a much greater understanding of what the process is. And she identified stages that people experience when they are anticipating a death. And it's been transformed and transitioned into how we understand the grief process as well. And so the feelings the stages that she identified were, first, we are in denial. We experience anger. We experience the sense of bargaining. If I just do this, maybe it will all go away, or it'll all be better. There's a resulting feeling of depression. She said that we eventually get to a place where there's acceptance of the loss. And later, and in some further of her work, she added a sixth stage, which is that there's hope And finally, she worked with Dr. David Kessler, who's another renowned grief specialist, and they identified a seventh stage, which wasn't in her original model, but the idea that we need to have opportunities for meaning making following a loss. Her book On Death and Dying was required reading for me when I was earning my master's degree in social work, and I have always been thankful for that because it has shaped the way that I think about and do the work that I do in so many ways. So Dr. Kessler has carried on Dr. Kubler-Ross's work, and he says that applying the stages is really important. Now, one of the ways that Dr. Kubler-Ross's work was criticized was because it appeared to be very linear. Dr. Kessler says these stages are not linear. We go back and forth between those feelings, but the feelings are all part of the process, and that's what is the takeaway here, is those are the elements that we all experience in our grieving. And so he applied these stages to the pandemic. And what he said is the application of denial is what you'll find in people saying things like, the virus won't affect us, the numbers aren't as high as reported. Anger is everywhere. I'm sure you've seen many examples of it. You're making me stay home, you're taking away my activities and my privileges. There's anger at those who are not social distancing and not wearing masks, and there's anger at those who are. It cuts both ways. Bargaining in this pandemic is the sort of statement like, if I social distance for 2 weeks, everything will be better, right? It's all okay if I just quarantine for 2 weeks. Sadness is that I don't know when this will end. And he encourages us to embrace that sadness. And finally, Dr. Kessler says that acceptance is where the power lies. And that is the statement that this is happening. I have to figure out how to proceed. I can wash my hands. I can keep a safe distance. I can learn to work virtually. I'm going to have a good time in spite of this. And so once we get to that place, then we can move instead of being stuck in our grief. The other point that's really important to make is that we as men and women grieve differently. And so I want to be sure that you maybe see yourself in this model of grief that was also brought to you by Dr. Kenneth Doka and his colleague, Dr. Martin. So intuitive grief is the grief that's experienced in very affective ways. So the emotions of it, it's what I wear on my face. It's sort of the way that I process my grief. Where instrumental grief is experienced physically and in a sort of shape of restlessness or of cognition, where I need to do something to work through my grief rather than expressing it. And what they've said is that women are generally more predisposed to express grief in intuitive ways, and men are generally more predisposed to express grief instrumentally from a more cognitive or active response. But this is not true, not 100% true across the board. There are people who experience a blended form of this intuitive and instrumental grief. And so there's a continuum of patterns of how we all respond to grief. And it really ranges from intuitive to instrumental, and it's influenced by our culture, by our gender, how we were socialized, how grief was modeled for us when we were young. It also is influenced by our birth order and our role in the family, and by our innate temperament and just who we are internally in our personalities. My favorite model of looking at how we process grief is the dual process model, and I wanted to bring that to you because it makes a lot of sense to me. So first of all, I'll start with my visuals, and that is again to remind you that our grief is very unique and distinct to ourselves. It is like fingerprints and snowflakes. There are no two alike. And so your grief is your grief, and how you experience it is yours individually. And so the underlying premise here is that grieving is very uniquely individual. There are alternative ways to coming to terms with loss. There is a need for dosage. So we can't, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said, we can't look into the sun continually without turning away. And the same is true for our grief. We can't live with it, be in it, experience it fully all the time. We have to look away. We need to have some respite from it at periods of time. Grief involves other related losses and stressors that are happening at the same time. And there is not one size fits all in terms of the way grief is experienced. And the next is a model that shows you, hopefully this will make sense to you. When I teach, I talk with my hands, and so I'm often, putting this on a board and moving my hands between it. So I'll try and do this with words. But the idea is that we oscillate between that loss-oriented focus where we're grieving, there's an intrusion of grief. We are having to try and let go of this person or experience or valuable, life event, and that there's a denial. I don't want to get through this. I just am focused on my grief. That's one of the domains. The other domain is that relief, where we have to attend to the way our life has changed. We have to do new things. There are distracting events, distracting experiences that pull us away from that focus on grief. That there can be a denial or avoidance of how bad it hurts, and that we identify new roles and new identities and new relationships. And the idea here is that we oscillate back and forth between this very loss-oriented focus and then our new restoration-oriented being, and that's how we process it. And my best example of that is I went back to school when I was in my 40s, and I literally lost my, in many ways, the life I had before when I was a department manager and I had a certain amount of competence. Went back to school and suddenly realized I didn't know how to be a student again after a long time away. And so I went back and forth between the loss of what I experienced as my competence and the restoration of, making changes into this new role. And I think that this fits for me in so many of the changes that we make in our lives as we go back and forth. We don't land on restoration and live there forever. We go back to the loss periodically, and it reminds us where we've come from. So coping with grief, there are a number of ways that we cope with grief. First of all, we focus on emotions. We use emotion-focused coping, where we try and manage our emotions. There's problem-focused coping, which is the associated troubles that come from the loss that we need to attend to. So, paying bills and managing the household and taking care of children and older adults who are under our care. But we oscillate between the positive and negative affect. We go back and forth. We oscillate between the positives and the negatives, we confront it, we avoid it. It is just this back and forth process. And what Stoyb and Schutt, who originated this model, say is that at first, after a loss, the frequency of that oscillation is much faster. And over time, it slows down and we oscillate much less frequently. The dual process model accommodates the difference between male and female grief, that instrumental and intuitive grief I mentioned a bit ago. The dual process model also allows for different cultural norms, because depending on your cultural background, you have very different experiences of grief. And the dual process model provides a framework for understanding what's known as complicated grief, where grief is chronic, grief is absent, grief can be very delayed. So this is grief that isn't worked through shortly after or within a relative period of time after the loss. So this dual process model gives a lot of flexibility and understanding the different experiences of how we process grief. And I'd like to stop there for just a minute and see if there are any other thoughts, questions, comments before I bring us to a close with some positive ways that we might work on the grief in the pandemic. Anything, Katie?
Yes, we have a couple things that came through. The first question I'm seeing is, any other examples of community-wide shared loss in addition to COVID-19?
Not in terms of I'm not sure how to answer that question. There are other losses in terms of there's been all kinds of, there's been lots of racial injustice activities, demonstrations. I think some of those have been part of the loss in our community. I think there's been loss of a shared understanding about education I really wish I could be in person with this person so I would understand better how to answer that question, because I'm not sure I'm doing a very good job.
That makes sense. If the person wants to give any other details or background where they were coming from in the Q&A, that would be helpful.
Okay.
But I think that answer was fine. The next question I'm seeing is, how does one cope or grieve a disenfranchised loss?
Okay, disenfranchised loss is something that I talk a lot about when I teach this course. I think what we need to do is find a way to commemorate that, to memorialize that. So, you know, it can be writing a letter, it can be planting a tree, it can be finding some way to create a ritual around giving meaning to that loss and putting words to it so that it's understood, and sharing it with people who you know would invite gentleness. And that can be someone, a trusted friend, a trusted clergy member, a mentor, someone who can listen to the meaning of that loss, but really putting words to it, because without the public sharing of it, it just sort of lives and festers inside. I hope that's helpful. I'm a big believer in the use of ritual, the use of putting words on paper, doing things that again establish growth and support growth through a loss. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you for that. The next thing I'm seeing is, are you going to talk about ways of overcoming losses and ending grieving?
That's next. That's how I was going to end this. So yeah, thank you.
Perfect. And just quickly, we have somebody that gave example of shared losses. 9/11 would be a shared loss, maybe World War II deaths.
Okay, absolutely. I think that was probably where the person wanted me to go, and I was just thinking so much in the current time. So thank you for those examples. Absolutely. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some strategies for managing the distress, and hopefully this will leave you on an up note. There are some strategies for managing this distress. One comes from Dr. Kessler, and he says, when you're feeling it, when you are feeling this overwhelming distress, come into the present. Name 5 things in the room that you see around you that you are mindful of, and then in the moment remind yourself that yes, you are okay. And my best example of this was a student I had in my spring class who had taken a course in mindfulness and said, I was so overwhelmed. I was worried about my mother and my stepfather. I was worried if I was going to get COVID. And he said, I finally stopped and said, in this moment, none of those things have happened yet. So, you know, focusing yourself on right now, right here, right now. And mindfulness is a technique which focuses our full attention only on this moment, experiencing thoughts, feelings, and sensation, but not judging them, just experiencing what we're in the moment. Dr. Kessler also says that when you feel sad, allow yourself 5 minutes of being sad. Just allow yourself, don't push it away, don't submerge it, but feel it. Also, let go of what we cannot control. We can't control another's actions, but we can stay 6 feet away. We need to stock up on our compassion and sometimes realize that someone else's behavior is really coming from a place of fear and anxiety. And that we need to overprotect rather than overreact. So being very mindful, very careful, and again, finding meaning, whatever that is for you, however you define making meaning in your life. So some ways to cope with this pandemic grief are, again, acknowledging the losses, naming them, and the feelings that you have, finding ways to express that, whether that's talking with friends and family, cooking, listening to or making music, gardening, or other creative practice, something maybe that you weren't doing before that you need to try some new way of expressing. Consider developing new rituals in your daily routine to stay connected with people who've died, people that you can't see, and people who live together. Some of the suggestions that have been made are that people who live together may consider playing board games or exercising together, where people who live alone may consider joining a Zoom game time or a Zoom exercise time. My daughter teaches yoga on Zoom these days. And trying to stay in the present and focus on aspects that you do have some control over. So there's very much we don't have control over, but reminding ourselves of what we do and what we can. And this comes to you from the CDC. Pardon me. So we have to also cope with the loss of our routine, which often keeps us sort of on the straight and narrow, our daily routine. Paying attention to, again, our feelings, what we've lost, and writing them in a journal is a way to track what's happening. Thinking about our strengths and our coping skills. What have you done in the past? What did you do to get through 9/11? What did you do to get through other times when there was this overwhelming feeling? And remembering how we did that. Creating an adapted routine. So preserving a sense of order and purpose, including activities that might help you cope. Walking or exercising in some way outside, worship, hobbies that you may have maybe dwindled, but bring them back, and maintaining a regular pattern of sleep and a healthy diet is important. Also staying connected, using and being sure to be intentional about calling, texting, using video chats and social media. Pets have become a source of great coping with our loss of routine. I can't tell you how many cats and dogs come to class when I teach on Zoom these days. Limiting your news diet. Spending too much time with the news can focus us so intensely on what has been lost. I know that we learned that in 9/11. That's particularly a message that was given to parents and teachers, not to allow children to watch too much of the news. And the same thing is true for adults. And then remembering the journey. So considering the good memories and the big picture. Some ways of coping, again, recognizing it, acknowledging it, be with the pain, it hurts. And just being mindful that feeling pain is very human and that we shouldn't deny that it really hurts. Accepting our feelings, even the ones we don't like, even when we're afraid, we're angry, just naming them again, channeling our anger wisely so that it will go away and help us to heal. And so ways to channel that would be, again, exercising, journaling, being gentle with yourself, being kind to yourself, inviting help from people you know will be gentle in return to you, and seeking comfort where you need it. So asking for support from friends, figuring out how to make it through the difficult times, and recognizing that healing is that dual process, that oscillation, that it doesn't happen on a straight line, that one day at a time. And reminding ourselves there will be times that are more difficult, thinking about the holidays, thinking about things that might trigger events that happened, over the course of a year in this time period. And those may come back to remind us. Breathe. Be kind to yourself. Respect your body. Engage with others. Allow emotions to ebb and flow. Recognize the humanity in our emotions. Take one life 1 minute, not just one day, 1 minute at a time. Honor your loved ones and examine your expectations. Again, there's been a lot of changes in the way that we mourn, and virtual mourning has become a new way in this new normal. Making sure to connect with other people, inviting people to share on a conference call to make memories around a loss, coordinating a date to celebrate a loved one. My family just did a tribute to a loved one. It was a very moving experience. So there's lots of ways to connect with other people virtually. Creating memories, again, or rituals, a virtual memory book. You can make a blog, a web page, planting a tree, and asking for help from others, seeking spiritual help in this time. So virtual mourning isn't the same, but it's a way that we can make meaning. This comes to you from the New York State Department of Mental Health, and this is just helps for coping, right? Tips for helping others grieve. And this is ways we can reach out because sometimes the best way to help ourselves is to help someone else grieve as well. So acknowledge someone else's loss. Don't minimize or try to take away the pain. Avoiding statements like, he's in a better place. Know that grief is not linear. Focusing on the person who's grieving, not judging, again, not disenfranchising someone's loss, not rushing the process, allowing for crying in silence, just being present with someone who's grieving, lending a helping hand, and helping someone to recognize they need to take care of themselves when they're grieving. So recognizing that we're all in it and you may help someone else through their own grief. So I think the important message is to pause and consider here. Anytime we're forced out of our routine habits that we have opportunities for growth. COVID-19 provides an opportunity to clarify what's important in our lives and to ready ourselves to move on to a stronger, calmer, and clearer place. I truly believe this. I think we can use this moment in time to come away stronger, calmer, and clearer. Some of the life lessons we carry from COVID-19 are impermanence. We are vulnerable to illness and death. We are interdependent. It's undeniable. We are truly all in this together. And finally, gratitude, to be thankful and to speak words of gratitude to others. So I'll challenge you to think about, what will you take forward from this experience, and how can the lessons of COVID mark a positive turning point for you in your own life trajectory, on your own life journey. Some of the ways to make meaning in this pandemic are to reflect on what gives your life purpose and meaning, to use this opportunity to find new ways to express yourself, to figure out, notice how life events challenge the way that you give meaning to life, cultivating a sense of hope and gratitude, and focusing on your strengths, because that's what will carry you through. Making meaning with others, again, practicing kindness, committing to a we culture, connecting with others and helping others in need, and extending patience, gentleness, and to yourself and to others. This is my visual of the incredible growth. I love that this plant grew through this rock in one of the gorges down near Ithaca. And for me, this just speaks to resilience and strength in adversity that is found in the human soul and in the human spirit. Thank you very much for listening today. I would like to stop and just take any questions, comments that you have, and then I'll share just a couple other resources with you at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Waldrop. The first question I'm seeing is actually, could you make the slides available after the presentation?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to do that. Can I just, I'll send them to you, and can you?
That's perfect. I'll send them to everybody who registered just so they have them. Okay. I'm seeing a comment, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I'm seeing a comment, thank you for talking about this.
Absolutely. We all need to talk about this. We need to recognize what's happening to get through this together. So thanks for that.
Mm-hmm. I'm seeing another comment, wonderful presentation. This is helpful for so many situations, not just with COVID. I try to find humor in everyday situations. Every morning I send funny cartoons to family and friends so we can all start our day with a smile.
That's a great suggestion. You should add that to the slides. That's a great idea.
And then I'm seeing one last comment that says, excellent, thank you.
Thanks very much. I do want to be sure to share the Erie County resources for help. As Katie mentioned, their office is always available, Erie County Senior Services, but so is Crisis Services 24/7. And then the Jewish Family Services Program for mental health for older adults is really, really also a really good opportunity. And lastly, I wanted to leave you with this thought. Be soft. Do not let the world make you hard. Do not let pain make you hate. Do not let the bitterness steal your sweetness. We can get through this together. Anything else that we should open for? Should just be, are there other things coming in, Katie? I'm happy to just wait if there are other questions or thoughts or comments.
I'm seeing one more thing, and then we can just wait a couple seconds while you address this if anyone else says anything. How do you know if it's complicated grief? Okay,
that's a good question, and I have a ton of information on that. It's grief that there's a grief process that we all go through. There's no time period on, I'm often asked this question of how long is too long, when someone who is still grieving a year later. And what I'll tell you is grief never really goes away, and it comes back to us. And so, but in some ways we put it in perspective. When complicated grief makes someone non-functional, when they simply cannot think about or get back to a daily routine of any way, and it really is making someone just unable to function. That's really probably the defining line. There's a lot of clinical discussion about how to define this. What's complicated grief? What's protracted grief? What's abnormal grief? It's been called lots of different things, but it's really when it's the only thing you can focus on, and it stops you from carrying out the activities of daily living in a normal routine. I'm hoping that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. The last question I'm seeing, is there a book to read on disenfranchised loss?
Yes, yeah. I can put that in the, I can add that to the slides when I send them to you, Katie. There's actually several, but I'll give you Kenneth Joka's book because it really lays it out there. It lays out all different kinds of ways that grief is disenfranchised. So yeah, and you may be able to find it in the public library too. I'm not sure, but I'll send that, and I'll send a link.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm not seeing anything else, so I'm just going to echo that comment that came through about thank you for talking about this. We appreciate you having this discussion, educating us, normalizing it, which is important, knowing that we're all together. So without further ado, I think we can part our ways here and just be appreciative and keep moving forward.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me to do this, Katie. I appreciate it. And
Absolutely.
best of luck to everyone to prepare all of you.